We have a very simple DIY for you today. We're going to be working on a DIY calf raise platform or a calf raise block. And the way that I've designed this one is it should also be able to double as a foot platform for a low cable row. And you're going to be able to do this one even if you have very little or no woodworking experience whatsoever. If you get somebody at your local hardware store to make the wood cuts for you, which any Home Depot or Lowe's should do that for you, then as long as you know how to use a screwdriver, you can make this foot platform. In addition to being super easy, it's also going to be pretty cheap as well. This whole project is only going to run you about 20 bucks. You will need a saw of some kind if you're going to be making the cuts yourself, or you can get the person at your local hardware store to make the cuts for you. As I mentioned earlier, you can use a miter saw like I have here. You can use a table saw, or you can even use a skill saw if you have the skill. An impact driver, wood screws. If you're making the cuts yourself, you'll need a 10-foot long 2x6, or you can use a 2x4 if you're not going to be using this as a foot platform for rows as well. If you're not going to be making the cuts yourself and you're going to be getting this from a hardware store, you will need 4 18-inch 2x4s or 2x6s, 1 21-inch 2x4 or 2x6, 3 2.5-inch 2x4s or 2x6s. As a quick note, if you're only going to be using this as a calf raise platform and you're not going to be using this for seated rows, you don't need the 2.5-inch pieces, and we'll come back to why that is later in the video. And a couple of optional things if you want to be able to make your foot platform rounded instead of squared off on the edges. You can use a router or some type of electric sander, or you can just use some sandpaper and a little bit of elbow grease. And to make things nice, we are going to add some logos and some paint to it as well. Step one is to cut your 4 18-inch pieces of wood, and always remember the old adage to measure twice and cut once, because if you mess this up, you're going to be headed back to the hardware store to buy another piece of wood. And for the record, I essentially have no woodworking experience at all. Step 2 is going to be to cut the 21-inch section of wood, and since I have essentially no woodworking experience at all, I'm going to leave mine just a hair long, because if there's a little bit of an overhang on the top piece, I can always sand that down, but if I cut it too short, then it's too short. So to give you essentially what this is going to look like in the end, you have 2 supports from front to back that's going to keep it from rocking while you do your calf raises. Then you have 2 spine pieces that are going to go under the foot platform to support the weight vertically, so actually support the weight of you standing on it. And then the 21-inch piece is going to go down on top, and that is going to be the actual foot platform, the part that you're gonna stand on. So what I've done here is I've drawn a center line that runs all the way down the 21-inch piece, and also a center line on the 2 outside pieces. And what that's going to allow me to do is I'm gonna make sure that I have the midpoint of the foot platform and the midpoint of these 2 front to back supports. I'll be able to make sure that those are perfectly lined up, and then I can make a mark on the inside of these 2 front to back supports to show exactly where those 2 spine pieces need to go. So I'll make some lines right there. So now I have some markings to show where the spine pieces need to end at, so that I can screw the vertical supports onto these front to back supports. Based on those markings, I just went ahead and used a square to trace those lines all the way around to the outside. I found the midpoint for those 2 lines, and then I made a little X right here for the 3 screws that I'm going to be using to hold the front to back supports, hold that onto the vertical supports. And I'm personally going to take a drill and do some pilot holes for each of these screws. It's kind of an optional step, you don't have to do that, but I want to make sure this comes out nice and clean, so I'm going to do some pilot holes right here. For those of you that are actually good at woodworking, you can be sure to tell me how wrong I'm doing all of this down in the comments. So we're almost done at this point. The only mandatory step that's left is taking the actual foot platform itself and then screwing it down on the top. Now, I didn't get this perfectly flush, but it's not a huge deal at all. I do want one side of it to be perfectly flush, at least though, since I am going to be using this as a vertical surface so that I can do my horizontal rows. I'm going to be planting my foot against the box right here. So I do want this side to be perfectly flush, and then this will just have to be a little bit wonky. It's not a big deal. You're not really going to be able to tell unless you're looking for it, but all that is left is to do 5 holes. I'm going to do 2 right here and screw down into these front back supports, and then I'm going to do 1 in the middle and then 2 halfway in between. So I'll do 5 screws on each side here, and then we'll be pretty much done. Just paint it, make it look nice after that. If you're not using this for rows and you're only using this for calves, you're actually done at this point. This is a fully functional calf block at this point. The only other thing is, if you're going to use it for rows, we need to add a little bit of horizontal reinforcement. Since you're going to be pushing on it from a side angle, there's no spine under there to support it. And after feeling of this thing, it is actually incredibly sturdy as is. So I'm actually not going to put all 3 of those small pieces of wood that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. I'm only going to do 1. The piece of wood that I was working off of in the beginning, I had just enough left over to make 1 piece of the spine. And let's flip this over. I already have a little dot in the center right there, so all we have to do is slide this down in there. And just coincidentally, this fits so perfectly that just from the friction itself, it's holding it in there, so it doesn't even need a screw to hold that in. And it's actually, I mean, it's in there. It's not coming out. So at this point, the only thing left are those optional steps that I had mentioned. And you can use a routing tool, or you can use, you know, some type of sand or whatever you want to use to kind of round off one of the edges to kind of give a little bit better of a platform. Instead of having this sharp corner, have a little bit of a more rounded off edge for when you're doing your calves. And then the only other thing would be to paint it, throw some decals on there if you want to. I'm gonna make this one look a little bit nicer. I'll sand it down, put some paint on there, throw a Treadaway Training logo on there, make it look real nice. But this is the whole thing. So I'm gonna do the rest of that off camera, and then I will bring it back and show you the finished product. This thing turned out pretty great. We went ahead and put some black paint on there, slapped some Treadaway Training logos on both sides. The logos didn't turn out quite as good as I wanted them to. We don't really have a lot of experience putting heat transfer vinyl on anything other than t-shirts. So we did burn the logos a little bit. You can see the paint a little bit on the head of that logo, but that's fine. You know, it's a gym, it's gonna get dinged up anyway. It looks pretty darn good, and about as good as I could have expected it to for how spur of the moment this project was. And I have been using this for a couple of days now. So I have had a chance to use this for both calves and low rows. And I can say with complete certainty that this project was a 100% success and fully serves the 2 purposes that I wanted out of it. Is completely stable, and I would highly recommend you do this as well, because it was only 20 bucks, only took a few hours to build, and that was even, you know, coming up with the design and everything, and it was only a few hours to build. If you want to see a video where I talk about all of the DIYs in my home gym, including the full-on DIY calf machine using a landmine bar, go ahead and click this video. If you want to see my home gym tour, click this video. As always, God bless you and your family, and we'll see you next week. Well, now that the fun part's over, I suppose it's time to clean up the mess.